Well, I appreciate Dan for leading those songs, especially that last one on one step at a time. And we certainly hope that we get to a point where our faith can continue to grow and grow and grow, though our faith may start very small. Jesus himself said that faith can be like a mustard seed, just a very, very small seed in one's hand. And if it's nurtured properly, it can grow to become even greater than many of the trees out there. Well, there's a great example of that growth in faith in the story of Gideon from the book of Judges. Turn with me, if you will, to Judges chapter 6, and that's where we're going to be looking today, is a story in Judges chapter 6. Hebrews 11 verse 32 mentions Gideon among the faithful in that great chapter, which I find very interesting because when you read the first part of Gideon's life, really most of chapter 6, if you were going to think of like, well, what are the characters of the Bible who are as bold as a lion, you might not think of Gideon at first. Gideon was a man who needed a lot of nudging to get going. He was a man who needed a lot of confirmation to finally decide something. He was a man who needed a lot of encouragement by God to do what God asked him to do. And yet, like we said, Hebrews 11:32 does point out that Gideon was a man with faith. And he did some great things. But I think his story is really not a story about Gideon, it's a story about God, as the Bible is. It's really the story of God's patience with a man who God knew had the capability and the potential to be what he needed him to be, but just needed the encouragement and the coaxing for that courage to be brought out properly. So we're here in Judges chapter 6, and it says beginning in verse 1. Then the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. That's pretty much how every story starts in the book of Judges. If you're not very familiar with this book, if you've maybe never read Judges before, it's about a cycle of events that happen in Israel's history where for a while things are great and they follow God and they do what they're supposed to, and God is their ruler and they are his people and they represent him in their land. But then after a few years, sometimes a few decades, they fall away from him. They begin to follow the idols of the people that surround them, the Canaanites and everything. And God punishes them for their lack of faith. And some nation comes, in this case it's the Midianites and their cronies. And this nation comes and oppresses Israel for a time until Israel finally learns their lesson. And they plead with God and they beg God, we're sorry, please rescue us. And God, in the book of Judges, sends this sequence of incredible heroes, these rescuers, great men, and even women come and will rescue them. Deborah and Barak in jail with the tent peg. These heroes come along like Ehud. These heroes come along like Samson. Heroes come along, even like Gideon, a man who's called a faithful or a valiant warrior the first time that God speaks to him. But one thing about the Judges, though, before we get into Gideon's story, something to keep in mind. Again, if you're not very familiar with the book of Judges, the point of the book of Judges is actually not about the judges themselves. The point of the book of Judges is the way that God can take people, even weak people, even people with faults and failures, even people with some really, really glaring faults and failures, and he can take those people and shape them and mold them and drive them and motivate them and guide them so that when they obey him in faith, God can do amazing things for his people. That's really what it's about. And it's interesting how each of the judges that you read about in this book do have some kind of fault or failure. There's some way that other people look down on them, whether it's Ehud's left-handedness or if it's the fact that Jephthah comes from a certain background that people insult him over, whatever it happens to be. Each of these characters has some kind of handicap in their life that God overcomes. Not even just in spite of it, but sometimes because of that handicap. And God shows his incredible power and grace. So the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hands of Midian for 7 years. Verse 2, the power of Midian prevailed against Israel. Because of Midian, the sons of Israel made for themselves the dens which were in the mountains, and the caves and the strongholds. For it was when Israel had sown that the Midianites would come up with the Amalekites and the sons of the east and go against them. By the way, the Amalekites show up a few times in the book of Judges, and you kind of get why, like by the time of Saul, like God is like, you know what, I think I've had just about enough of you folks. Because they just sort of show up like every now and then it's like the Amalekites generally like, hey, can we get in on that? And here they are again, the Amalekites, right alongside the Midianites and the sons of the east. And they would camp against them in verse 4 and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza and leave no sustenance in Israel, as well as no sheep or ox or donkeys. They would come up in verse 5 with their livestock in their tents. They would come in like locusts for their number. Both they and their camels were innumerable, and they came in the land to devastate it. And so, in verse 6, Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the sons of Israel cried to the Lord. I guess practical application, and this is, by the way, an application you can make in like every single story of the Judges. Do you need to be brought to rock bottom before you call on the name of the Lord? Is that what you really need? Now, some people it is. And Judges is like the repeating story of it. Like, just put this on the repeat and rinse cycle because it's every single story. And so Israel departed from God, and they did evil in his sight, and they followed after the gods of the people around them, and they worshiped their idols. And so God punished them for that, as he has every right to do. By the way, if you think God is being unfair in the book of Judges, try to understand it from God's side. Imagine, and I know this is going to hit some families hard because this is real life here, but imagine what it would be like if you found out your spouse had a bunch of online romantic partners. And you, the spouse, the first love, have been replaced by a bunch of Tinder profiles or porn stars. How would you feel? And so the fact that God is angry every time Israel does this, and the fact that God punishes them every time Israel does this, is not only understandable, but is absolutely within God's right and his character. Do you have to be brought down to rock bottom to finally call out to God? Like what is the lowest that you've ever been? What is the most desperate that you've ever been in your life? Maybe that was God reaching out to you. The lost job, the health scare, the disaster or catastrophe that you had to live through, the drama in family. Like maybe that was God providentially saying, what do I need to do to you to get you to stop it? How low do you need to go in your pride and your arrogance and your stubbornness to finally relent and seek after me the way that you should? What needs to happen to you? And it's interesting, isn't it, how in the book of Judges, it's always a long time. Now, relatively speaking, these 7 years are actually less than some of the other times. There's other times where it's like 40 years. And so they were under the hand of this foe for 40 years, and Israel suffered for decades. It took you 7 years here. It took you 7 years to finally say sorry to God. Imagine what it would be like in your marriage if it took 7 years for you to apologize for that indiscretion. 7 years to take responsibility for something that you've done to hurt your spouse. It took them 7 years. 7 years of Midianite oppression. Now we meet Gideon here. Pick up in verse 6 or verse 7. Now it came about when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord on account of Midian, that the Lord sent a prophet to the sons of Israel, and he said to them, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, It was I who brought you up from Egypt and brought you out from the house of slavery. I delivered you from the hands of the Egyptians and from the hands of all your oppressors, and dispossessed them before you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you have not obeyed me. Sometimes the best sermon is the most straightforward one. Just get to the point. I know, you're looking at the clock going, Ryan? I'll tell you what, there's no more getting to the point here with this. You abandoned God, God punished you, and all you have to do is come back. Look at everything that God has done for you. He just wants you to come back to Him. And that's it. That's it. But you won't. You haven't. You need to start doing it. You need to obey God. And that's the point I'll bring out at the end of the lesson is, really the way to grow faith is to obey God. There's no better way to grow your faith than to obey God. Now, the angel in verse 11, the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak that was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, as his son Gideon, we meet Gideon for the first time, was beating out wheat in the winepress in order to save it from the Midianites. That's how desperate things have gotten. Normally, you would beat out the wheat out in a big open area, right? A large, like a paved area. But here he is in a winepress. You know, he's kind of off to the side. Maybe it's been built into the ground. You know, he's beating it out in a wine press, just so desperate because the Midianites come, and anytime the Midianites see an Israelite with something, with food, with livestock, the Midianites show up like locusts, and they either steal it or destroy it or eat it. And so here's Gideon desperately trying to save anything, just anything he can from the harvest. It just shows how desperate the situation is for them. And the angel said in verse 12, the angel of the Lord who appeared to him and said, The Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. Valiant? And hey, listen, he's the only one out there doing anything. Everybody else is hiding in caves right now, and at least give Gideon some credit. I think we kind of mistake Gideon for being sort of sheepish. I don't know that it was sheepishness that was always his problem, but you know, he's bold enough that with Midianites kind of snooping around the land, like he's doing something. Give him credit, he's doing something. But how does he take it then when the angel calls him, O valiant warrior? Maybe what it is, O valiant warrior, is presuming something. Maybe it's saying that God looks at you and sees potential. God looks at you and sees you can grow to become a valiant warrior. Someone looks at you and says, you can be a Christian. You know that? You don't have to be a sinner. Well, I'm not a sinner now, or I'm not a Christian now, but you can be a Christian. You can be. Oh, I'm never going to be able to beat these sins. You can. You can. I just don't think I'll ever be able to do personal evangelism. I just get too scared. You can. You can do it. God looks at Gideon and says, valiant, that's a valiant warrior right there. Maybe it's the same thing when God looked at Saul of Tarsus. God looked at Saul of Tarsus and said, let's see, persecutor of the church, violent threats, oppression, Pharisee of Pharisees. I think he'd make a good apostle, actually. You know, God looks at Saul of Tarsus and says, I think that's apostle material. God looks at Gideon and says, you're a valiant warrior. Now, Gideon's response is, verse 13, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, then where are all of his miracles? Excuse me. If the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. And so the Lord looked at him and said, and I like that, the Lord looked at him. I don't know what that look was. But when the Lord looks at you, you better pay attention. Go in this your strength and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you? Have I not sent you? I love the challenge there. Gideon is saying, what happened? What happened to all the great signs and wonders you used to do for us? What happened to you being this great Lord who saved us and rescued us? And our fathers told us about all the great works that you did. Why have you abandoned us? And God's response is, go and get to work, and you'll see. Have I not sent you? It's almost like he's answering the question with a question. God, where have you been all these years? Didn't I just come and tell you that something cool's about to happen? Have I not sent you? He's answering the question with a question. Now, it's really interesting, again, that he's called a valiant warrior, and yet in response to that, there's this hesitation that he has, this reservation. Where have you been, God? I think it's interesting, and I want to be really clear about this. Gideon does not have a problem believing in God. Does he appear to believe in God? Absolutely, yeah. It's not a matter of believing in God. It's a matter of where has God been? What has happened that we're not seeing God in the same way, His actions, His behavior, His works that our fathers spoke of before? And I appreciate that about Gideon, because I think there's a temptation that we have. And even very recently, U.S. soccer star Megan Rapinoe, right? She tore her Achilles. Was it tearing her Achilles, I think? In her last professional soccer match of her life. And she goes and injures herself. And in the press conference afterwards, she said, listen, if there is a God, this injury is proof that He doesn't exist. Oh, because God didn't give you everything that you wanted. Oh, because something bad happened to you, therefore God doesn't exist. Oh, because you really do think God is a vending machine that can only be approached at your convenience and at your beck and call, therefore God doesn't exist. I appreciate Gideon. Because for Gideon, it's not a matter of, well, God, we haven't seen any miracles, therefore God doesn't exist. Gideon's question is not about God's existence. He believes in God. He just doesn't know where God has been and what has changed about the relationship between God and Israel. Now, as we move through the story, and we'll accelerate this a little bit because we really do want to get to the battle that unfolds a little bit later on. But here in the rest of chapter 6, Gideon proceeds to receive and then ask for additional signs from God. There's a sacrifice that he prepares that is immediately taken up by God, consumed totally by God, and the angel of the Lord disappears. Wow. And he's commanded by God, before you can go out and fight the Midians, there's something I need you to do. I need you to cleanse your father's household of the idols. You got to get rid of the idols. And the community where his father's family lives is quite upset by the whole thing. They're upset when they wake up the next morning and the idol has been dealt with, because Gideon, in the middle of the night, along with 10 of his followers, takes care of those idols. And I think what I love about this story, and I know that we accelerated pretty quickly through it, but I think there's a great practical application, is before you can be really useful for God, you got to make sure that the home front is taken care of. Before God can send you out to fight the proverbial Midianites, God needs you to go to your father's household and get rid of any of the idols that are there. Because if you're not taking care of things at home, you're going to have a really hard time going out in the world and doing God's work. Now, in practical terms, Maybe that is about your marriage. Is your marriage really strong? Is your marriage really sound? Are you really solid in those home relationships? Your kids, do your kids respect you? Do your kids love you? Are you involved in your kids' lives? Are you teaching your kids the gospel? Are you doing the Bible class lessons with your kids? Are you encouraging your kids to participate in things, to make friends with other kids at church? Like, are you doing everything that you can on the home front? Because if you're not, I think you're really going to struggle when you go out into the world. Are you taking care of the sins that are in your own life before you go out and tell other people not to sin? Like Romans chapter 2 points out. In Romans 2, Paul goes on and on and on through the first half of the chapter saying, you tell other people not to commit sins, but then you're doing the same thing, you hypocrites. So I think that's a great lesson there is Gideon, you got to go deal with those idols. You got to get rid of all the idols in your father's house. And then we can go deal with the Midianites. And it's not popular either. The people in his hometown don't particularly care for this. Gideon rabble-rouser, Gideon the troublemaker. Bring Gideon out that we can go ahead and he got rid of our idols, so we're going to get rid of him. It's not a popular choice. But it was one that he had to make to be the servant for God. Then we get to the end of chapter 6, and it's this very interesting story about fleece and dew. Let me read a couple of things here real quick from Judges chapter 6, because we got to let this story play out here in Judges chapter 6. Now, in verse 36, they hear of the Midianites are beginning to gather. It's time, and Gideon is still a little unsure of things. He's a little sheepish, a little cautious. And in verse 36, Gideon says to God, "If thou wilt deliver Israel through me, as thou hast spoken, behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor." I don't know if you've ever seen anybody shearing sheep. It's really a cool thing. And for someone who has, I don't know if it's like ASMR or something like that, where you just watch things that are really satisfying. There's something about watching a sheep get sheared and it comes off in one whole piece. Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. There's just something very deeply satisfying about that. Am I crazy? Am I the only one? Anyway, the fleece that he's talking about is probably that, where they've sheared the sheep and the wool comes off in one whole piece, and that's what the fleece is, okay? So he gets this fleece from the sheep, this fleece of wool, and if there is dew on the fleece only, but it's dry on all the ground, then I will know that thou wilt deliver Israel through me, as thou hast spoken. And so in verse 38, it was so. Now you would think you've never read the Bible before, and if you read that, you go, okay, whew, good, confirmation. Gideon's going to go fight the battle. And then you go, So he said in verse 39, "Do not let thine anger burn, that I may speak once more. Please let me make a test one more time with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, and let there be dew on all the ground." And in verse 40, God did so that night, for it was dry only on the fleece, and dew was on all the ground. So what do we make of this? Signs from God, asking for dew on the fleece and dew on the ground. Okay, a lot of people look at the story of Gideon and they believe that this is a story that proves you can ask for signs from God. God, I've got 2 job offers. If I'm supposed to take this job over here or this job over here, then God, when I turn the TV on a random channel, you fill in the blank, whatever it is. Is this story of Gideon being like God, if I'm meant to marry this person, then the restaurant will be closed tonight, and God, if this is what I'm supposed to do, then make it rain this afternoon. If it rains this afternoon, then I'll know that it's a sign from God. Is this what the story of Gideon is showing to us? That we can ask God for God, I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to be doing here, so be really, really helpful if you go and give me some kind of 50-50 sign on this. Well, a couple of things that we notice here about this story. First of all, has God already told Gideon what he's supposed to be doing? Yes. So in performing these signs, is God giving Gideon any new information? The answer is no. There is no new information coming from God. It is simply confirmation of the command that's already been given. And so I challenge people when they're like, well, listen, I had a vision, or I just felt a feeling, or I think God was giving me a sign. It's like, well, was he telling you any different than what's already here? Because if he's telling you anything different than what's right here, then I want to show you a passage in Galatians chapter 1 that says, even if we or an angel from God speaks to you a different gospel, let him be accursed. So if there's anything that God is telling you in a dream or a vision or a sign that's different from what he's already said, then I think we've got a problem. So that's the first thing is, Gideon is not being given anything that God has not already told him. He already knows what the command is. But the second thing is, he's also not asking for mere coincidences. And I think that's an important part of it also. Is, God, if I make every single green light on my way home, then I know that that's what you want me to do. Like, you take that job, move that place, marry that person. Do we really leave life's great decisions into the hands of things that could be nothing but coincidence? Gideon is not asking for coincidence. It's like, God, if you really want me to go fight the Midianites, then make clouds show up in the morning. Or make a bird tweet. He's not asking for coincidences. He's asking for something that couldn't happen. Because if you leave a fleece out on a cool morning, what's going to happen to it? It's going to have dew on it. But what is there also going to be on the grass that surrounds it? Dew. Now, if you lay a fleece out and there's dew all over the grass, but there's no dew on the fleece, you're looking at something that this is not just coincidence. This is not like I saw a raven and I took it as a sign from God. It was something miraculous. Only God could have done it. Only God could have confirmed it. And so I don't view the story of Gideon as any kind of proof text for you can just ask for random signs from God to decide where you're going to live, what job you're going to take or something like that. That's not what this story is showing. Here's what this story is showing. That God is very long-suffering with a man who should have gotten up the first time God told him to do something and should have been fighting the Midianites already. And yet God has forbearance and is very long-suffering, and God allows Gideon the time that he needs to grow his faith. That's what Gideon needed. Gideon's faith was a mustard seed, a tiny mustard seed. He'd been beaten up by Midianites. He's now rejected by the citizens of his father's hometown. He's been called a valiant warrior, and he's not really 100% sure that he can live up to that. He's a mustard seed, and God is giving him time to grow. And as if that's not enough, when we get now to the valley of Jezreel, where the big battle takes place, with the Midianites on one side of the valley surrounding Mount Morah, which that's the hill of Morah off in the distance, God even nurtures the faith of Gideon even more by saying, Gideon, this is too many soldiers. You've got too many soldiers here. It says in verse 3, whoever is afraid and trembling, let him return and depart from Gilgal. So 22,000 people left and only 10,000 remained. That means there were 32,000 people who showed up. More than 2/3 of them left because they were afraid. That's still too many, God says. That's still too many. And through this process of elimination, they get all the way down to 300, with just 300. And God comes to Gideon and says, all right, got to trust me on this. I want you to sneak over to the camp of the Midianites. I'm going to give you one last sign to give you courage. And he goes to the camp of the Midianites, and he's kind of snooping around, and he hears some in the front guard of the Midianites. These are the guys at the picket line. And he overhears them talking about a vision that they have, and they interpret the dream as, it's none other than Gideon and the Israelites, and we're all going to die. And at that point, Gideon knows, you know what? The Midianites are even more scared right now than I am, because God's with me and God's on my side, and surely God has given them into our hands. The Lord said, the people are too many who are with you for me to give them into your hands, lest Israel become boastful, saying, my own power has delivered me. And I love the way that God puts that. 32,000? That's too many. Send most of them home. 10,000? Still too many. Because when it's God doing the working, the amount is irrelevant. Let me give you 4 quick applications. I know we're out of time here. And they may be reviewed because we've touched on each of them a little bit. But just kind of as we bring the story to a close, you can go ahead and read how it ends. The main focus of this lesson wasn't really about the battle itself and everything like that. It is a great victory, by the way. It's a great victory. The Israelites, only 300 of them, only 300. They come with torches and trumpets and pots, and they surround the Midianite camp in the middle of the night with these torches. They break the pots and reveal the torches, and they start blowing trumpets. And I'll tell you what, the Midianites don't know that it's just 300. But if we were surrounded by 300 trumpets and 300 torches, you might assume that that's 30,000 people, right? You might assume in the dark, you're just seeing trumpets and or you're just seeing torches and hearing trumpets, and they're in the darkness, and you might assume that for every torch that you see, there's 100 guys behind it, and for every trumpet that's blown, there's 1,000 guys following its trumpet call. And so the Midianites, in a total panic, fall apart. And they utterly are defeated. Now, the lessons then. Number 1, God sees us for what we can become, and He pushes us to meet our spiritual potential. God looked at Midian, and Midian was the man of the hour. He was the hero that God needed. Now, he's just a regular guy, just like we're regular people. He's just out there trying to save some part of his harvest. He's just beating wheat in a wine press, desperate to have something to feed his family that winter. He's just a regular guy, but God looked at him and said, I think you can be the man I need right now for this job, oh valiant warrior. But you got to grow that faith. Seeking a sign the way that Gideon does ends up looking kind of silly. And even Gideon knows, and I love the way he puts it at the end of chapter 6. Like, when Gideon has asked for that second sign, even Gideon acknowledges, God, Lord, don't let your anger burn against me too bad. You know why Gideon says that? Because he knows he's pushing it. He's just asking for more signs from God. He knows that he's pushing it. And seeking a sign just looks silly when God has already told us what to do. What has He already told you to do? Believe and be baptized, and you shall be saved. He already told us that. And if you're waiting around for a sign, no sign will be given you but the sign of Jonah, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead and the preaching of the gospel. Now, faith is a long process, and it requires a long time to grow for many people. It's a mustard seed, and it takes time to become mighty. And the best way to grow your faith is to obey God. Obedience is the path to growing your faith. Not meditation, not just reading without any application, being a hearer of the word and not a doer of the word. Obedience to God is how you grow your faith. And the last point is, the real tragic part of Gideon's story is maybe a lesson all its own, and maybe we'll have to do a part 2 sometime on this. I've backed myself into a series yet again. But if you read about the rest of Gideon's life, winning that battle was the high point, and it's not real good after that. He ends up making this golden ephod out of all the rings from the camels' noses of the Midianites. And this golden ephod gets set up as if it's some kind of representative symbol of God. And maybe what started off with the best of intentions ends up becoming idolatry, just straight up idolatry to Israel. Gideon has 70 sons also, because he had a lot of wives. So he becomes a polygamist. And that's pretty problematic. One of his sons, who wasn't even one of his wives' children, it's as if like you have enough wives, you also got to get a concubine as well and have Abimelech. His story, which is very victorious after that battle, really becomes a tragic story. And I think a lot of it comes down to spiritual laziness. When we believe that all of our battles are in the rearview mirror, we've won the battles, we've put the work in, we did the work already. Now it's easy street. And I think that is exactly playing into Satan's hand. And that's what happened to Gideon. And we can't let that happen to us. If you're not a Christian here on this wonderful and beautiful Lord's Day, you really ought to be. You have an opportunity to plant that mustard seed in the ground right now, to start that journey of faith by listening to the words of Jesus himself, that he who believes and is baptized shall be saved, but he who does not believe shall be condemned. Believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Be willing to confess that belief before others, to put a life of sin behind you. And listen, that life of sin wasn't doing you any favors anyway. Why didn't you cast it off and seek for something better? To be buried in the waters of baptism with Christ and to come out in newness of life, raised up, just as he was raised from the grave in newness of life, so that the hope of salvation bathes you in God's sunlight for the rest of your life. Whatever spiritual need you might have, please let it be known by coming forward as we stand and sing. My calling yet shall I not hear.